I spent my whole damn life in the city. I could go for broke, but the capital is in me. I spent my whole damn life in the city. Anywhere I go, DC's coming with me. I spent my whole damn life in the city. I could go for broke, but the capital is in me. I spent my whole damn life in the city. Anywhere I go, DC's coming with me. I spent my whole damn life in the city. I could go for broke, but the capital is in me.
Welcome, everyone, to District Divided, a DC sports podcast, more specifically a Commanders podcast. I am Amit, and that is Bijan Robinson, author of grindingthemocks.com. K-Dot unfortunately could not make it today, but we had this interview lined up for some time with Benjamin, so it works out. I have a co-host this week and really appreciate you being on with me today, Ben. This episode is going to be focused on the first three rounds of the Washington Commanders draft. Of course, we have three picks, pick 16 overall in the first round, pick 47 overall in the second round, and pick 97, a compensatory selection in the third round. We're going to get to each of those. First things first, Ben, how are you doing today?
It's game time. This is like my Super Bowl. So yeah, we're 1 week from the draft at this point. I'll probably hopefully be waking up from a nap that I took after all my models and scripts and data has been collected and run. So hopefully at this point I'll be like taking a power nap to get ready for the draft. So I'm really excited for this week.
Dude, excited to have you on. And so for those that don't know, Ben collects thousands of mock drafts to figure out who is going where, and based on the wisdom of crowds is what he calls it. And so he ends up figuring out, okay, these many people have mocked player X to this team. This could end up happening. And he ends up writing his own mock draft, of course, based off of all this data. So unlike other people that just go, oh, I sort of feel like this is going to happen, Ben actually has a lot of data to back up his picks. And so that's why you're such a valuable guest on today, my friend. So without further ado, why don't we just go ahead and get into it? Pick 16 overall. What does your data say in terms of which position we're targeting?
Yeah, so, the positions that the Commanders are targeting in this past month, so the last 3 weeks, basically.
Okay.
It's really been a huge focus. Like about 60% of Commanders picks in first round mock drafts have been cornerback.
60%.
Yeah, 60%.
Wow.
So it's really a lot. So I think basically and this aligns with one of the strengths of the class. And I think that's really kind of fortunate for Washington that, the needs that they have in terms of the picks that are positions they've been targeting in those first few rounds, are positions that are really strengths of this draft. I just mentioned cornerback, offensive line, particularly the tackle class is pretty good. Then, you can also add the tight end position as well to kind of if you had to make me guess, the first three rounds of the draft, which positions the Commanders would focus on, it would be those in terms of the data. That's what we're seeing in grinding the mocks data over the past month. Okay,
I see. Wow, corner. And is there any corner in particular, or maybe a top two that we can discuss at pick 16 overall?
Yeah, they've really been mocked almost all of the main first round guys. The one that they've really been mocked the most, maybe about a quarter of the time, is Penn State cornerback Joey Porter Jr. You might remember the name. His father, Joey Porter, I guess Joey Porter Sr. now. It was a longtime linebacker for the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Legend.
Yes, a legend, among other things. So otherwise the cornerbacks that have been, I think mocked to them are, the best case scenario of one of the top two cornerbacks. Mm-hmm. That's Devon Witherspoon from Illinois and Christian Gonzalez from Oregon. If they made it down to them, those were some guys I think, if that happens, I kind of don't see it happening. I think both those guys are potentially, a little bit earlier than where the Commanders would be. Okay. But the other guy that I think is, in terms of a sweet spot, will be definitely, I think, have a really strong chance of being around, much stronger than Witherspoon and Gonzalez, is our own DMV, University of Maryland cornerback Deonte Banks. Okay. So to me, I think Porter and Banks for cornerbacks are the best bets for Washington in the first round, but there is a possibility, depending on maybe some positional runs at other positions, like maybe a bunch of tackles go. And so, when that happens, it just allows some of these really talented players to maybe drop into Washington's hands.
That is honestly incredible, though, that over 60%. So what was the next highest position group in the first round? Because I know for me, I think very early on, I was actually mentioning Joey Porter Jr. I mean, we hit a home run, in my opinion, with the Jahan Dotson pick last year, Penn State guy. Joey Porter Jr. has a lot of buzz around him. Penn State guy. Why wouldn't you go back to the same well at a position of need? Sure, but that offensive line certainly needs help too. Like, was there a pretty big gap between cornerback at 60% and another position group like the offensive line?
Yeah, offensive tackle was the second most mock position in first round mocks for the Commanders over the last month.
Wow.
And so, but it's not even really close. Like it's like maybe 10% of mocks. It's really like cornerback and like everything else.
Wait, like 10% of mocks for offensive tackle.
No, yeah, for offensive tackle
versus
over the last
60,
month.
60, a 50%. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's a real big gap. The chart does not look very helpful.
Okay.
But yeah, no, I think the idea is that the Commanders, I think, like I said, I think it meets the need that they have, this draft strengths. I think offensive tackle, there's a sort of similar deal. Let's say that there's an earlier run on cornerbacks. Well, then these offensive linemen could fall. And so, to me, the offensive linemen in the first round that are tackles that I think could be interested to the Commanders are guys, throughout this class, like, potentially Darnell Wright, the right tackle from Tennessee. Paris Johnson, maybe not, the offensive tackle from Ohio State. And you also end up with guys like Broderick Jones, the offensive tackle from Georgia.
Right.
Those are kind of the main guys. There might be some other ones, but I think those are the top guys in terms of tackles. I don't foresee Northwestern's Peter Skoronski making it out of the top 10.
Okay. And is there any sort of quarterback buzz or anything like that in the first round? Or
there is, but it has to come via trade. And so there's so few mock drafts with trades in them. I have seen a couple, maybe even some prominent mocks that have them trading up. I don't necessarily see that happening. I think it would be really surprising. I think that
it would be. Yeah.
they're kind of going to cash in for Caleb, hopefully for next year.
Sure.
I foresee them drafting a quarterback potentially, but I bet it would be someone to compete with Sam Howell in the later rounds, along with Brissett. To me, it's not a bad idea to draft another quarterback. I think drafting one high would be kind of out of step with the process they have. They really have a really strong roster, a pretty complete roster. They have some areas of improvement, like, maybe in the secondary and offensive line, but, they really are missing that quarterback. And we've talked about that for the last 3 years.
We have
back to the 2020 draft. What would we do? And the answer is, it's not that Chase Young isn't really good. He's an awesome player. Just, imagine the Commanders with even a Tua or, maybe a Justin Herbert,
yeah,
on the team. And, even with, Tua's, a huge improvement over the quarterbacks that they've had, assuming that maybe he doesn't get hurt as much or for whatever reason. But yeah, to me, quarterback is a real strong possibility, but I would put it in the later rounds, like maybe on the third day, sometime in the or the fifth round again. I'd really doubt that quarterback is going to be their pick in the first round. I think it's expensive to move up, and they have a lot of needs, and they're thinking for the future.
Yeah, no, and you talk about cashing for Caleb. I would be very curious to see, and it would be quite telling if they did move back out of the first round entirely, let's say, to get a first next year. Who knows? That would also represent a level of faith in Rivera and company, because they would have to be willing to do it as well. They might be in win now mode. So very interested to see what ends up happening in the first round. Appreciate your data and insight there. So it looks like cornerback most mocked position to the Washington Commanders at a rocking 60% of mock drafts. That's incredible over the last month. Followed by, and not closely, by offensive tackle at around 10%. And then it seems like quarterback, a little bit of buzz, but that would be via trade up. Let's jump to the second round. Let's talk about day 2 picks. That would be rounds 2 and 3, of course. So we have pick 47 overall. So it looks like most mocks will have us taking corner in the first round. Let's say, that happens. Well, actually, for that matter, even if it didn't, what position groups being mocked in the second round, Ben, for the Commanders at pick 47?
You see, I think a much heavier emphasis on offensive line.
Okay.
So, in terms of like the tackles in the second round, you could potentially see a guy like, I'm looking at Dawand Jones, the kind of really, very large offensive tackle from Ohio State. He was the right tackle on the other side of Paris Johnson that we mentioned earlier. You think about interior line, a guy like Cody Mauch from North Dakota State, who has a smile that only his mother can love. He's got a real toothy smile. When he gets his first a contract, I'm sure he'll get.
We'll have to find a picture of this
He'll have
guy.
a
All
glow
right,
up like a Bobby Firmino, Jurgen Klopp, Liverpool glow up when it comes to those teeth. But yeah, so those are some guys. I think maybe Matthew Bergeron from Syracuse. But yeah, I think in terms of the offensive line, it really does drop off in terms of talent into the second round. But there's good depth. I think Mauch, would be a great pick for Washington.
Okay.
He has versatility. He played college tackle. He can play guard. He also played some center, I think, at the Senior Bowl. So just a lot of versatility, but also a guy who I think can come in and play right away. And I think offensive line could be a focus in the second round for them. Maybe even an interior guy.
Well, I'm actually really glad you mentioned Mauch in that case, because if you look at the track record, and Commanders fans will know this, of course, we have gone after versatility as the main asset within a player. So, like, of course, you want the skill set and maybe specialized, but if they're versatile as well, that could be a name to certainly look out for over there, Mauch.
There's one other guy that I think might be interesting. It's another kind of interior lineman, Steve Avila from TCU. I think that's another guy that could potentially fit in there at 51. I see that maybe Mauch could go in the first round if it's like a late round, but he might be. I think more likely he'll be kind of early mid round 2. So that puts it in the Commanders' wheelhouse. But I think a guy like Avila could be in a similar position. Not really as versatile, but he's a big dude and he can run power. I'm sure the Commanders could use him.
Okay, and so those are some options at pick 47 in the second round. And what about the third round, pick 97 overall for our Washington Commanders?
Yeah, so I think another position that's a really strong one in this class is tight end. So there's talk that there could be maybe between like 8 and 10 tight ends selected in the top 100 picks, in the first 3 rounds, basically. And so that's definitely a good spot for the Commanders to be in. In terms of the guys that I think if they were looking at second round tight ends, you see a guy like Luke Musgrave from Oregon State could be a guy. Darnell Washington from Georgia, if he doesn't go in the first round, maybe could be a guy. Third rounders, you get into more like Sam LaPorta from Iowa and Tucker Kraft from South Dakota State as the options for tight end. And then I think, the tight end class is pretty deep. You could also see another Penn State guy, Brenton Strange, Luke Schoonmaker from Michigan. So there's a bunch of guys. It's a really deep group. I think you could see as many as 8 tight ends go in the top 100 picks, which is a lot. Normally you only see maybe something like 4, maybe 5 sometimes. And so this class will, really, I think, kind of be a real boon for the tight end position this year.
And so I actually have a question about the tight end position, Ben. So, there are rumors about like Michael Mayer from Notre Dame and Dalton Kincaid from, I believe it was Cincinnati, if I remember correctly, or Utah. Sorry. Just thinking about Kelsey for a moment. So from Utah, thank you. What are your thoughts on round 1 tight ends? I was looking at the history of tight end at round 1, and it seems to me like the ROI isn't exactly where it should be for round 1 tight ends. What's your take on it? Is it kind of like the running back position? Like, how is this working out?
It's not like the running back position, but I do agree that the return on investment can be really disappointing for the team that drafts them. So tight end is a notoriously difficult position to develop. Most players, even players that are supposed to be really unique, like a Kyle Pitts, take time to acclimate. And it's not like a wide receiver where you really can just kind of just jump in and boom, you're like in it, like an offense. The tight end position is just so different, and it's really something that if you spend a high draft capital on, you really need to have a plan to use the guy. Like it's really it's really kind of awful if you draft a guy like Dalton Kincaid with the receiving ability that he has, or Kyle Pitts, for example, and you're having him block and be a decoy. Like, what are we doing here? Like, you got to really dedicate the offense to kind of making it worthwhile. And so, for example, you saw that kind of not happen in Detroit for TJ Hawkinson. But when he moved to Minnesota, they really spent. He looked really good. You know why? Because they really added him as like, well, we're going to really treat you as an important part of the offense and dedicate plays, dedicate targets. And I think it really helped get, back some of the value that they lost when they traded for him. But when your team like picking a guy in like the top 10 at tight end, like you really need to treat him like a wide receiver. And so that's, I think, why more often than not you end up with, these kind of athletic types who don't have production who fall in the draft, like Travis Kelce, like George Kittle, who can become great NFL tight ends because they're athletic, but the offenses in college don't really feature tight ends in that way, and neither have the NFL games to the extent that I think it would make sense. But this group, I think, has the opportunity if they land in the right situation and they land in a place where the offensive coordinator will dedicate targets, then I think it's a great pick. So we'll
Yeah.
see what happens with Bieniemy. I mean, he had Kelsey. They had multiple tight end sets. So I mean, I know Washington has drafted a couple tight ends over the past couple of years, and they drafted a guy from
We got
Boise
Cole
State.
Turner last year,
Yeah,
right?
and then Cole Turner last year. So they have had guys, but these are just guys. I think if you
Mhm.
had the opportunity to draft a guy like, for example, like Dalton Kincaid, but I think a better option might be Luke Musgrave, who really lacks the targets. He's been hurt and then underutilized somewhat in his offense in college. But boy, can he play. I think he performed really well at the Senior Bowl. He's a real plus athlete. So to me, Luke Musgrave, I think if you're going to go cornerback in round one, if you wanted to go wait for offensive line, potentially, then maybe you go Luke Musgrave in the second round. But like I said, there are a bunch of tight ends that I think will be on the board in the third round. And so if that's a weapon you want to add to the offense, you could add a guy like Sam LaPorta or Tucker Kraft, or even guys like, another Penn Stater, like I said, Brenton Strange, and then Michigan's Luke Schoonmaker. Those are all, I think, solid options for the first 2 days of the draft for the Commanders.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful information here, Ben. I also had a question about Bijan Robinson. So I know that these days, a lot of people believe, hey, running backs first round, not really worth it. You can get a lot of production out of around 2, 3, 4, 5, even undrafted guys. You can get production from these players. What makes Bijan Robinson so special? Is there a chance that the Commanders would take him at pick 16? Because people are talking this guy up like I haven't seen a running back talked up in quite some time.
Yeah, I think this is kind of the first time since Saquon Barkley in the 2018 class where people are kind of saying, hey, like this guy might be the best running back, since in his kind of, we'll call it generation, whatever, in his class,
Understood.
right? In this
Yeah.
past 4 years since Saquon. And so that's not really a generation, but like people are talking him up that way. I don't necessarily, I haven't really watched the tape on him. I'm not a tape grinder. I'm a mock grinder, and so I'll talk about what I see in the mocks and what I see in some of the data we have on player rankings. And the player rankings consensus have him as a top 5 player in this draft. Those player rankings don't take into account positional value, which is like somewhat of its own problem. And if you would kind of adjust for positional value, I think Bijan might still be worthy of a first round pick, but maybe a later one. I don't think the Commanders are going to have the luxury of being able to even think about drafting Bijan, because I think one of my kind of big predictions in terms of what I think about the structure of this draft is that people are not being creative enough when they think about the team player match for Bijan. I think there are teams in the top half of the draft, maybe even I think in the top 10, who would look at their board and pick the best player on their board regardless of position, even if they have a guy on the roster. And so to me, in my last mock draft that I put in for Football Outsiders, I had the Atlanta Falcons drafting him. And everyone says, oh man, they had 5th round Tyler Algier from BYU last year who was great. And I said, hey, like they drafted Kyle Pitts at 3 when, and so they don't necessarily care as much about positional value. You can call, Kyle Pitts a unicorn. You can call Bijan Robinson a unicorn, a special, unique player. There are teams who want that and will look at their board and say, hey, that's the number 1 player, positional value to be damned. We're going to take him. And so I think the mock drafts are they're giving the NFL more credit than I think they deserve, because I think that this league does not necessarily care about positional value as much as the mock drafts are saying. And so to me, I think if Bijan was there at 16, I would hope that they would have the restraint to not pick him.
Okay.
They have used a lot of draft capital over the years on running backs. You look back at the 2018 class, Darius Geis, a second round pick that was a total washout from a character perspective.
Yeah.
And somewhat of a play on the field perspective. They drafted Bryce Love, right, the running back from Stanford, in the next year's class. You end up with Brian Robinson last year, Antonio Gibson, that I thought was overdrafted in the 2nd or 3rd round. So they really haven't been shy to use top draft capital, not a first rounder, but like I said, I hope that if they do have the opportunity, it wouldn't surprise me if they did it, because it seems like that's just their MO. But they've had guys. I think the 2-headed combination of Robinson and Gibson last year was replaceable and fine. But you can probably find some good value in this class. There's a lot of good backs in this group. I'm personally partial to my University of Pittsburgh, alum Israel Abanikanda. think he'd be
Okay.
awesome, and you can get him in like probably the third or fourth round. So yeah, there's a lot of really good players in this class. The running back position being valued as it is, I still think Bijan goes in the top 10. That's my one of my structural ideas for this draft. And in my mock draft that I do, my last one next week for Football Outsiders will also have him in the top 10. I think that's a really important structural piece because you really don't see players who are top 5 talents fall out of the top 10 without character issues, and we know that Bijan doesn't have those.
And so actually, you've started plugging, like, you have your mock drafts. Shout out University of Pittsburgh for you. Why don't you tell us more about where we can find you? Because this has been an awesome interview, and really appreciate the insight that you've had for rounds 1 through 3 and like what could happen, what couldn't happen, and stuff like that. Where can we find you, Ben? Feel free to plug yourself, who you're working with, stuff like that.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for having me on again. Love being on. So you can find the kind of public home of Grinding the Mocks at grindingthemocks.com. We're also on Twitter at Grinding Mocks. There you'll find the link to the site, and you also find a link to my personal Twitter if you really want to connect with me there. But yeah, I've been writing for Football Outsiders for the past few drafts, and so I've been writing mock draft articles as well as some articles about kind of which players stock is going up and which players stock is going down. So that's something I'll be finishing up tonight that hopefully goes out tomorrow. And then a mock draft next week. That'll be my last mock draft of the class. You mentioned that I write my own mock draft, and what does that look like in my data? I'm pretty bad. But my hope is this year that I get a few things trending right. My rankings always score pretty well in my data. So last year I had in my top 32, 30 of the top 32 players last year.
Which, by the way, when you compare that to other people, I know you say pretty bad, but when you compare that to the best mock drafts, that's right there. It honestly is. I think Peter Schrager was bragging about 30 out of 32. You got 30 out of 32 just with the data. I mean, that's incredible.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. It's not me. It's the people out there, the DraftNet community. But yeah, so last year, 30 out of 32, I think we're going to regress quite a bit this year, I think.
Okay.
My projection is that I still only get maybe 26. I'd be happy with 25.
I think a lot of people would be happy with 25, just to be clear.
So yeah, so the mock draft is kind of realistic in that way. Like, it's not going to just have all top 32 of my players. It's going to try to find that one guy that might be that third rounder that gets drafted every year, even though it's kind of a Herculean task. But yeah, I'm excited for that. And then I also have a really awesome partnership going with my friend Kevin Cole, who's a writer. He used to work for Pro Football Focus, and now he runs his own Substack, a newsletter, and YouTube channel called Unexpected Points. And so I've been sharing data with him to kind of power some of his writing that he's been doing with terms of kind of fantasy and player projections, as well as some really interesting research that he's been doing throughout the draft season. And we're hopefully going to do a draft live stream. We'll see. Like I said, we'll see how awake I am for that, because I've been working kind of all day on that front. But that's what I got going on. And so I would love for folks to check all that stuff out.
Oh, absolutely. And we'll put stuff in the description below for this video so that you can catch all of that. So you said you may have a draft live stream. We may also have one, funnily enough, talking to Kate about that just now. One question I had was like, in terms of tweeting during the draft, are you doing any of that? Are you doing it before? Are you going, okay, this person was taken 6 overall, like, here's the chart? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, I'll be live tweeting during the draft. I'm probably going to be like trying to search for like what the pick is before it's announced, so that I can get the card ready. But yeah, the goal is to have
Mirov's great for that.
Yeah, a lot of people last year, I think like Jordan Schultz from The Score was pretty on it. But yeah, at a certain point, I'll stop doing that probably sometime in the early second round, so I can just kind of sit and enjoy from home the draft, which is like, one of my favorite things. But the first night is always really tough because I've been hard at work all day, and so oftentimes I get really, really tired. So like I said, I'll need to be caffeinated up to to high hell for sure for the first night.
Yeah, you got to power through for one more day, but we really appreciate everything you do, Ben, for being a consistent guest every year and giving us this information on the data and what could happen rounds 1 through 3. Thanks again for being on, man. And this was District Divided, a DC sports podcast, more specifically a Commanders podcast. I'm Amit. This is special guest co-host over here, Bijan Robinson, author of grindingthemocks.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like it, please share it with your friends, please comment. We're not doing the comment mailbag today. I'm going to save that for when K-Dot's back. So we're going to do double, some for this and some for the last episode as well. But we really appreciate you guys all for watching. And we will see you next week. Draft time. It's a week away, Ben. It's a week away.
Hit the outro, right? Hit the outro, Polly.
Yeah. And last question, though. Last question, just before you go.
No.
Your Cincinnati Bengals. How are you feeling about them for this draft?
Yeah, I mean, last year's draft was kind of a little bit of a wash. Not a lot of contributors. I'm hoping that there's something interesting. Like, would love to see maybe a wide receiver at some point in this draft for them.
Ooh, okay.
If they take a tight end, like I mentioned earlier in the first round, I'd kind of be a little disappointed because there's just so many mouths to feed. I'd love to get an edge rusher.
Okay.
Would love my guy, once again, University of Pittsburgh, Kalijah Cansey, defensive tackle, to be our next Aaron Donald / Geno Atkins. But yeah, a lot to be hopeful for as always. And with Joey Burrow at the helm, we always have a chance to win, which is awesome.
That you do. Perennial contenders at this point. A little bit of bonus Bengals coverage for you guys now. Enjoy. See you next week.
In DC, we're just hoping that you listen.